Today, how movements to make war more humane and less harmful may, ironically, be causing more war. I'm Cliff Mark, and this is Good in Theory. Today on Good in Theory, we have Samuel Moyn, who is a professor of law and history at Yale, and also a host of Digging a Hole, which is a podcast about legal theory. Is that right?
Correct.
Why is it called Digging a Hole? Is there a story?
Well, there's a children's book that's about these two characters, Sam and Dave, and it just so happens that those are the names of the two people who run this podcast at Yale Law. So we kind of did a shout out to those children's characters.
That's really sweet. I like that. Also, Sam is the author of several books, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World, and your most recent book, which is called Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So the book, as I understand it, is about how American efforts to make war more humane and get rid of all the atrocities and bad things which we hate actually has made America more okay with going to war and has kind of enabled this ongoing forever war dynamic that we have going today. And that's kind of the catchy thesis of the book, that humanitarian efforts have actually made war longer and more possible and maybe even worse. And I want to get into that, but let's start by just laying the conceptual groundwork that you're working with. So your book begins by talking about a couple of different approaches to war: pacifism, humanitarianism. Can you tell us a bit about those and what the difference is conceptually? Maybe we can start with pacifism.
Sure. Thanks for having me, first off. So, different people, different, proposals to constrain war, are go way back. I mean, you find them in Deuteronomy, for example, and in the Middle Ages, there's feudalism and, many other examples. I'm interested in modern times, and in the 19th century, you get these kind of competing agendas. And the first sign of this one, in which I'm really interested, kind of humanizing or making it less full of suffering for combatants and civilians affected by war. But there was also this other agenda that has had a kind of spotty record lately, which is not having war. And it's kind of amazing that appeared, because for most of history, there was no belief that you could end things like, poverty, slavery, war. But in the 19th century, all of those became kind of credible possibilities. So I'm interested in how the anti-war perspective, sometimes, which was like outright condemnation of all wars, kind of where it came from, how it gained traction and what happened to it in our time, which I think was to get pushed to the margins.
Interesting. Okay, so tell us a little bit about then the birth of pacifism. So you're saying that before the 19th century, people thought, war is bad, but it's just part of life.
Essentially.
But then what gave people the idea that, hey, you know what, let's try not doing it?
So, I mean, a lot of people all along, and even today, have thought some wars are good. And in the 19th century, there was this other group of people, which you could call, and like in contrast to the humanizers and pacifiers, the intensifiers, who actually thought war was essential for renewing, masculinity and making civilization, great. But there were some all along, going back centuries, who kind of thought war was an evil that, you couldn't get rid of because of, various reasons. So I think it was like poverty and slavery in that regard. You have people complain about those things, but it wasn't worth kind of opposing on principle because it wasn't believed that you could eradicate these things. So
It's like bad weather.
yeah, 19th century, you get more optimism. And, one reason is new interpretations of Christianity, but also I think the French Revolution and the rise of, commerce and certain progressive secular views also kind of, play into this. And the idea is we could edit war out. And given that it is evil, not just in like its costs for how it's fought, but just having it at all, why not try? And so you get some people mobilizing, and in a way they failed in some kind of absolute sense. There's a war in Ukraine right now, but in a broader sense, they have had a kind of tremendous effect on our assumptions on what statesmen and women today kind of say about cross-border conflict. And even, some argue on the fact that we just have fewer international wars since the middle of the 20th century.
Well, we can't. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily credit the 19th century reformers with the change in war since the middle of the 20th.
Well, I think, it was a long-term project that started in the 19th century. And, after World War I, it becomes hugely, popular because that one was just so bad. And transatlantic citizens sort of mobilized in unprecedented numbers. And, it takes World War II, ironically, and American hegemony. But in a way, those old peacemongers kind of like set some things in motion that got institutionalized in the middle of the 20th century. Now we can still argue that the real reason there's no, war across the Atlantic until, Ukraine or, a few other events is nuclear weapons took it off the table. But these peacemongers argued that we could restrain states and we could have treaties and international bodies and things that would keep war from happening at least some of the time. And it seems like their plan comes to fruition in the middle of the 20th century, even if there are a lot of other factors in explaining, Pax Americana.
But I want to come back to that.
Sure.
So the let's not do it. The pacifism viewpoint are these peacemongers. They say, don't do war. It's bad. Bad things happen. Then there's another approach to war, which is, I don't know, what would you call it? Humanitarianism?
Yeah, I call it humanizing war, by which I just mean reducing the suffering in war once it starts for soldiers and civilians.
And so what is that viewpoint, and who are some of kind of like the signal advocates of it? Where do we see it in history as compared to the peacemongers?
So I think it's in a sense new. The peace view is old in the sense that there were like prophets and visionaries, like in the Bible, who dream of like lions lying down with lambs, and they just think it can't happen until the end of days, and modern times changes that and brings it down to earth as like a real possibility. But I don't think there were folks before modern times who said we should reduce the suffering in war if we can. And you start getting that in the middle of the 19th century with the founding of what we now call the International Red Cross. And it really comes from the response of one man, a Swiss, gentleman named Henri Dunant, to like a battlefield he ran across in the 1860s. And he was so horrified that he decided to see if he could get states to agree to let like do-gooders like him help soldiers bleeding out on battlefields. And from that first, treaty that he imagined and got kind of written down in the 1860s. The Red Cross was born. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first one in 1901. And actually, I kind of am interested in the fact that Barack Obama, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, he like name checked Junot.
Okay.
And so from the 1860s to the present, you have this, let's say, competing or, supplementary goal to not having war, which is make it more humane if you have to have it. And so that's this other impulse. And I'm trying to raise the question of whether it actually is kind of a competing agenda and not just a nice thing to have around if you have to have war.
Right. Okay. So Henri Dunant, he's I don't know, what does he do for this? Is he like a lawyer, or a doctor or something?
He's like a businessman, and he actually first travels to kind of and happens across this battlefield in Italy. It's the Battle of Solferino, because he's on a mission to find the French emperor, who at that time is Napoleon III, to get permission to run his business in Algeria. And right. So it just happens that he sees this battlefield and he throws himself into the cause of trying to make war more humane.
So he turns up, he sees this battlefield, there's people bleeding out, their arms off. And he's like, ew, this is awful.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be, this martial, virile activity, but actually this is pretty gross.
Very gross in a civilized
And we
age.
get these guys some Band-Aids.
Absolutely. And it, you might say, well, why not get armies to take care of their own soldiers? It's just that, Dunant thought that if they wouldn't do it, there should be states agreeing to let neutral private actors, citizens like him and eventually his buddies in the Red Cross do that work when armies fail to take care of their own.
And so one of the key elements of him being able to get this treaty done is that it's neutral, right? He's like, I'm not judging you guys for doing war. I'm not taking sides. I'm only against the suffering of the wounded.
Yeah. I talk in the book about this. In the 1860s, he's not a pacifist. He's not, he's against war in the same way you or I might oppose some war or other, but he's not joining the anti-war cause. He accepts the inevitability maybe of war and says, well, if it happens, then we ought to make it less brutal for all concerned. Now, when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, one of the organizers of kind of the peace movement gets really upset because she says, this prize wasn't for humanizing, it was for pacifying. And so she seeks him out and makes him announce that he's for peace too. But, for many in the anti-war camp, this humanizing project is kind of threatening because, it seems like it concedes the inevitability of war, which they want to challenge. And maybe it does.
I like that. That's a sort of earlier clash of these two viewpoints.
Exactly.
So we have the people who are saying, oh, we just need to not have war. And most people, I think, today are against war. I don't know many people who are arguing for the martial, the renewal of the spirit that martial activity gives. But most people also think, hey, the Red Cross is great. We should humanize war. There shouldn't be that much suffering. But you're saying at this early point, the first Nobel Peace Prize, the Red Cross, which is, a lot of people like that organization, people were like, no, all they're doing is almost PR for war. They're just like making it easier to do. This is supposed to be about peace, and humanizing war is not at all the same as arguing for peace.
Exactly. And, one reason I start with the 19th and early 20th centuries is that there was a much more open debate about this because first, there was a bigger peace movement. And then in part for that reason, there was a lot more skepticism about the project of merely making war humane. Now, I don't want to take things too far. There were a lot of people who said, of course we aim for peace, but if we don't get it, we, still think making it what results humane is worth striving for. Now, that's actually my view too, but it's just interesting that some of the earliest advocates of peace, and I do a lot with this, Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy in this regard, kind of raise these concerns about the humanizing project. It's not that it wasn't a good thing, but what if there were kind of unanticipated risks or unintended consequences that went along with it? And I think they were right in those kind of qualms about the humanizing project.
Great. So let's then outline a couple of other positions. There's Tolstoy, who, as you outlined, he becomes very extreme. He's a absolute pacifist. So he thinks that any humanization of war, you're just making war okay. What we need to do is abolish the thing. In the same way, he takes a similar attitude towards slavery, right? Like all these regulations for making slavery more humane. He says, no, just get rid of it. It's wrong. Then you have the humanizing aspects, like it's inevitable. We're going to have war. Let's humanize it. Then there's another position that we haven't mentioned that you mentioned in the books, where you have Clausewitz talking about it, and some American Air Force guys talking about, hey, if you want wars to be short, don't worry about making them humane. You can make them as brutal as you want, because the more brutal, the more killing you have in a shorter time, the more humane it is going to be in the long run, because that's how to make peace, is to do maximum brutality in a short period of time. Is that right?
Yeah. So I would put it slightly differently. That's right that there was that other camp. I mentioned it before when I said there were people who actually wanted to lean into war and intensify it. Now, almost no one in that camp was really wanting not to have war. Actually, they loved war, but they would say as part of their PR that actually, if you care about cruelty and peace, you should want no holds barred war, because there would be a fringe benefit in allowing intense war, that it would break out less frequently, or it would last a shorter amount of time when it came. So Clausewitz says this. Tolstoy, when he writes War and Peace, he isn't yet a Christian pacifist. He puts in the mouth of one of his characters the position that he would leave war brutal so that we know what we're doing when we embark on it, and therefore we would fight it less frequently. And an American who actually writes the first national code for an army in modern times, named Francis Lieber, he says that if we have brutal, intense war, it will be short. So all of those folks loved war, and they weren't trying to get rid of it, but they would kind of say, well, if you're a pacifist, you should still side with me. Or if you're a humanitarian, you should still side with me, because, not only are my wars great, but they lead to enduring peace, and they're less cruel in the long run, even if they're cruel in the short run.
Is there any reason to believe them?
I don't think so, but I think what's happened is that position of loving war has just gone underground, and a lot of people, harbor that view. It's kind of amazing. You said that you don't know anyone who just embraces war, but if that's true, it's kind of bizarre that we have so many wars that, for which they're such a flimsy basis. It seems like George W. Bush liked war, and some of the neocons who gave him the idea of invading Iraq,
I think
Vladimir, what's he doing? So there are, if you start out with the view that, well, a lot of wars don't need to happen, but happen anyway, well, someone wanted them. And maybe
I guess what I mean is I don't hear people. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like you said, it's underground. People are not out making the case, but clearly it's doing something for someone.
Yeah. I mean, some people say, well, look, what happened in the 20th century is that rhetoric changed and all wars became defensive. And maybe that's true. I think there are fewer wars, but it's also true that the way statesmen talk about them is in terms of defensive war rather than saying openly.
Right. There's no more departments of war.
Exactly right.
So we talked a little bit about the 19th century and how World War I was so bad that brought back some pacifism. Another one of the big watershed moments in your story is World War II, particularly the Nuremberg trials and what happened after it. So how does that work as a node for the story about pacifism and humanizing war?
Well, just to go back, we talked about the 19th century peace movement, which basically was about transatlantic peace. And, that meant really what you could call a Christian white peace.
So out in the colonies, you can still go bananas.
Absolutely. And it was the age of empires, obviously, where these ideas gained traction. And so what a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people want is an end to inter-imperial wars. And in a sense, they get it at the end of World War II. A transatlantic peace, basically it is created and remains under American auspices. What I think changes then in real terms is that while America had fought a lot of wars in the Western Hemisphere and on its own territory and in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, in and through World War II, it becomes the global hegemon, and European empires start disappearing and America starts fighting a lot of wars, a lot of places in the name of the transatlantic, free world. And those wars, like the old imperial wars around the world, remain brutal. The end of World War II in the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam. What I think is significant about the end of World War II then is not that war becomes more humane. It's really two other things. One is that America takes charge definitively through today. The other is that there was an agreement that, at least, for lip service purposes, that what was worst about war was having it, not that it was fought brutally. And so the United Nations Charter of 1945, I mean, the world's still only 50 states then, but they say war is off the table unless it's defensive or the UN sanctions it. And at Nuremberg, starting the same year as the UN Charter and going into the next one, 1945-6, they say the worst crime is starting an aggressive war. And there are so many good reasons for making that the kind of main concern. Let me just mention them. First, if you start an illegal war, you're much more likely to, commit war crimes in the course of that war. But then so much becomes legal once you're at war. Killing soldiers in any number, which is not a war crime. Killing civilians in large numbers, which only becomes, a war crime later. And even today, killing civilians is legal up to a point. All the money that's spent on war, especially misbegotten wars, and could have been spent on something else. All the destabilization that's caused. I mean, in our time, the war on terror in places like the Iraq theater, or take the case of Libya after 2011, more people died not because Americans and their allies shot at them, but because the places were destabilized and there was just enormous violence that ensued. And all of that is the result of, wars not worth having, but they weren't war crimes. There were war crimes, but only a small percentage of the death. And so for all those reasons, I think people used to say, let's just, the most important thing is not to have wars unless it's absolutely necessary, not to prettify them. not to humanize them.
So war as a whole just has inevitably a ton of terrible consequences.
Correct.
And the war crimes are just kind of like the ones that make the best headlines.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we can go back and say, oh no, Nuremberg, it omitted the Holocaust, which is true by and large, and that's a shame. But it included a lot of concerns that in a sense we lost after the 1960s and 70s and kind of changing our priorities and focusing on how war is fought, and especially on atrocities, and not having them or punishing them after the fact.
So that's interesting. So I want to bring that up because, as you know, elementary and high school student, when you're learning about the Second World War and why it's so bad, of course you just get the idea that war is bad, but there's also a lot of focus on the Holocaust and atrocities, right? Those, like I said, they make the best headlines, and they're also how, at least in my Canadian public education, it was explained to me why war is so bad. And so one of the general positions is just believing that this view arose in response to World War II and the Holocaust. But you're telling me that actually that wasn't the mainstream view in the 50s, at the end of the Second World War in the 40s. It was that actually just war is bad.
Correct.
It's not just the atrocities.
Correct. I mean, now it took a war to stop Adolf Hitler, so it's not like everyone converted to pacifism, but especially in a nuclear environment, people had learned from the world wars that war is hell, and it's hell not just for the civilians who are killed illegally, but for all of these multifarious consequences. And so you can go back, and it is amazing how little attention there is to the death of the Jews in World War II, not just at the time, but in the years after at marquee events like Nuremberg. And in part, that's because of just a lapse that people didn't know or didn't care about what we now think was the worst thing that went down in that period, alongside Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which people knew about. But it was more that like they had a sense that, well, those in power across the transatlantic, they had lost, sons, brothers, husbands in the millions, tens of millions, not once, but twice. And their states had kind of lost their global hegemony, as a result of these world wars. Europe had to kind of seek shelter under America's wing against the threat of communism. So I think people back then sort of thought the worst thing that happened was that we had these world wars, not just the atrocities that took place in the course of them. Therefore, looking forward, we organize ourselves to kind of, start with not having wars unless it's absolutely necessary, and not merely care about the innocent who died in them.
Right. So World War II, total catastrophe. Going forward, let's not have any wars, at least not between empires, not transatlantic wars, but we'll continue to have this form of brutal warfare sort of in the periphery. And then at some point, this changes and we start to have a more like humane view of war. When does this start changing?
I think it's really the 60s and 70s for a few different reasons. One is decolonization. So the number of states quadruples, and the subjects of the most brutal war, the victims, now have states of their own. Yeah. And they can get rowdy, and they can try to change kind of international affairs themselves. And one thing they do is say, could we actually have a law that makes war humane? Because clearly it hadn't happened so far, especially for global war. But then the West Europeans, second, have given up empire over those same people. And so they can, pose as moral. And there are all these like middle and lesser powers where you have many more people than before in a new world, a new decolonized world, who don't want to have the racialized world order of the past, and they want to take the moral high ground. And then finally, Americans are shamed by Vietnam briefly. And even in the military, there is My Lai, the massacre revealed in 1970 has been such a public relations disaster that the military says we can't fight the way we did in the Pacific in World War II or Korea or Vietnam, where it was just assumed that Asian life was cheap. I mean, you find people just saying that in the same way that Native American life had been cheap or Filipino life had been cheap in prior American wars. So, there's, I think ultimately the big explanation is that there's a cultural transformation.
So to recap a little bit, you have World War II, and then all the Western powers say no more war with each other. But obviously we still have empires, so we have to use brutal violence to rule them. But then you get decolonization, and all the victims of colonialism kind of say, new rule, how about we stop with the atrocities and massacres and brutal war? And European powers, since they no longer have colonies to dominate, they're like, of course, let's stop that. We would never want to do something like that. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so much easier to take the moral high ground after centuries when you didn't. And, the people who were once ruling the world and treating it, it very violently, becomes some of the big backers of more humanity and warfare. Even when, it's Americans are fighting it to protect, the European peace, which is ironic.
So now that the former colonial states, they want more humanity and more, the European powers, they want more humanity and more, and America is kind of the odd man out because they're still out there maintaining Western supremacy, trying to, protect the world from communism and stuff like that. And they're still waging brutal wars on the periphery in places like Vietnam, for example. So is that just it? It's that America kind of steps up to rule the world, and they're doing the same kind of thing Europeans were doing in imperial wars, or is it different? What's the distinction there? Is it the same thing or what?
Yeah, I mean, a lot more in weaponry, and the Europeans don't have napalm when they're fighting in Malaya or wherever. So a lot changes, and the death toll in a sense becomes worse. In part because the weaponry involved. I mean, 4 to 6 million die in the Vietnamese.
Astonishing.
War.
It's amazing how
and you don't really get death totals of that kind in imperial war. But it's in a sense the pattern is established in imperial war where so-called savage peoples are treated mercilessly. And of course, aerial bombardment, which, continues through Vietnam, and it is really, invented by imperial states of Europe to kind of pacify subject peoples. And there are no limits in the law. And of course, you see that in Europe in World War II, but especially in the end of the Pacific War.
I was going to say, in World War II, the Europeans famously airily bombed each other.
Correct.
It wasn't strictly reserved for colonized peoples.
Correct.
So with this backlash against My Lai and the atrocities in Vietnam, this is when even America starts to get the idea that maybe they want to move towards a more humane form of war to cool it with the atrocities and stuff, right? And I guess the next moment I would want to go to is the first time I remember in my own personal memory that I heard this kind of thing was the first Gulf War. And that's when I started hearing about surgical strikes and precision warfare. The idea seemed to be that this was going to be a clean war. There wasn't going to be big disasters and atrocities. The damage was going to be minimized. So is this a big moment in the shift towards humane warfare?
The first Gulf War is great because, we haven't talked about these new groups, human rights groups that emerge on the ruins of the anti-war movement, but commit never to taking sides in a war, kind of like the Red Cross, only to monitoring whether they're brutal. And the Human Rights Watch, the lead such organization, monitors its first war in history when it comes to the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. That's also the war, which is the first one in which U.S. military lawyers help pick targets to make sure that the air campaign is not as brutal as prior American wars. So it is a pivotal moment right after the Cold War when there's like a new consensus among reformers and within the state to push war in a new direction.
Nice. And then, but it really comes to fruition, according to your book, with the War on Terror, right? So as I understand it, there's 9/11, then Bush comes in and says, you know what? Forget humanity. These are unlawful combatants. We're going to do whatever we want. Guantanamo Bay, torture, whatever. And then there's a backlash against that, right? So what happens there?
Yeah. So, a lot of people's, enduring view of the War on Terror is that it's brutal and illegal. And of course, I'm not going to say that it wasn't. But to me, the essential thing was how briefly George W. Bush and his servants kind of make that move of trying to return to before humane war. Because by the end of Bush's 2 terms in office, he's returned to the pale without ending the War on Terror. And then Barack Obama comes into office and says, far from ending the War on Terror, I'm going to reinvent it. My War on Terror is going to be torture-free. I'm going to take care when I transform the war with drones and special forces that they be deployed consistently with the Geneva Conventions and with applicable constraints. So it's like a reversal, not just from Nuremberg, but from the moment after My Lai, because atrocity, could remind us why we shouldn't have war. And the fact that there was a big anti-war movement when My Lai was revealed kind of threw fuel onto the fire and ended the Vietnam War. But the reverse happened after Abu Ghraib was revealed in 2004. The War on Terror continued with the bug in the program of torture and inhumanity removed, and permanent war remains.
Like, I think this contrast is so interesting in the book between, throughout history, the pacifists have been using atrocities as a reason to say, look, this is why war is so bad. And then you have Abu Ghraib and all these torture photos, and Obama and, a lot of Americans are like, war is good. Could we just do it without this? Could we just have like the sugar-free version? Maybe.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? Why this time it was different?
Well, I think it's a complex moment. So you're absolutely right. And it's essential to say that there's a large number of people who were offended by the conduct of the War on Terror, but not the thing itself. And they like a permissive environment for at least their great power. Then they get angry when Putin breaks the same rules. But I think it's only fair to say that there was a coalition around torture and other infractions, because I think, some people just had been trained morally to think that torture was this unique evil. And it was noble of them to say that has horrified us, not the war, not all the bad things, involved in war in general, but this particular thing. And then there were maybe the most interesting kind of part of the coalition. It's those people who think that the best way to undermine the war is by making hay of war crimes. That kind of worked after My Lai. So why not try it again after Abu Ghraib? But I think what we learn is that that group made a bet that kind of didn't pay off because they had the reverse effect. They kind of helped the state eliminate the stigma around the war, and it ended up going on rather than stopping.
So could you then describe? So the hinge in the story is that Obama says, "Oh, you know what? You're right. Atrocities are bad. Let's humanize it." So what does humane war look like? You mentioned so it's drones from on high. There's secret strikes by special forces, but no boots on the ground. Very few civilian casualties. No atrocity. Is that?
Well, ideally, I mean, I would never say war can be humane or that American war is humane now, but it's more humane than its historical forms. Like if you compare Vietnam and the War on Terror in terms of combatant and civilian death. But more important is that actors like reformers outside the state, Human Rights Watch, and actors within the state, within the military, are applying these constraining laws, and that there is an effect. I mean, certainly there's rhetoric. So you look at Obama's main two speeches around the War on Terror. First, the still utterly amazing Nobel Peace Prize address in late 2009, and then his drones address once they became known in 2013. And in both cases, he says, "You elected me. I can't give up war. I never said I would. But I will be different than Bush was. And I'm going to put a stop to the inhumanity and the illegality and the conduct of the War on Terror." And it's in that, context that he cites Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, and the person who convened states to make the first Geneva Convention. So it's kind of fascinating that Obama understood after Abu Ghraib that one way to legitimate war is to say, well, at least it's not brutal anymore.
So great, because a lot of people I think would say, well, isn't that fabulous for Obama? Isn't it so great that he is taking responsibility for this foul conduct of war and ending atrocities?
Yeah.
But in your book, he's kind of the villain. So can you tell me why this move was so, maybe it ended up being nefarious?
Well, at first I'm ambivalent about Obama. I mean, I do think, of course, if the choice is between brutal and humane war, we choose the latter. And to the extent he understood, the moral principle that should lead us to do so, then I celebrate the man. And again, it's whatever your view, it's just amazing that he placed this concern at the center of his presidential rhetoric. If I get tough on him, it's because I think that he could have gone further. He could have stopped the war on terror, especially after the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. And there were a lot of other wars that he initiated, most notably the Libyan regime change. And so, my bigger concern is that Obama, far from stopping, intensified this dynamic of America pushing the boundaries of permission to go to war when it wants. And then you get this compensation of promises to do it humanely, to make the fight humane. And I just think as Americans or citizens of the world, we look out and we should not rest content with politicians who, embrace and affect the right to go to war when they please and promise us in compensation that the results will be less brutal than before. And so a lot of this kind of then turns on, well, which wars actually made the world a better place, were defensible, were worth fighting? And I can't come up with a list that has, any American war since World War II on it. And so the fact that America has made those wars more humane, it's not nothing, but it's not enough either.
Right. So, okay, it's one thing to say, yes, it's not enough. He could have gone further. But I thought that at least a lot of the controversy surrounding the book and a lot of the discussion is that it sounds like you're saying that the humanity of war, the new sanitization of war, has actually made it easier for America to do more, fight more wars, fight them for longer, fight them over unbounded territory.
Yeah.
So what I'm reading when I read it is that it's that the limitations on the conduct of war have served as a pretext or at least an excuse for the massive expansion of the scope of war over time and space.
That's accurate, but let me just, let me make that argument, in a way that disarms some obvious, responses, because, I want to make the argument carefully. First, it's just the case that whenever we make something less objectionable to some people, we make it more tolerable to them.
Mm-hmm.
And Obama would never have placed the alleged humanity of ongoing war central to his major speeches on foreign policy if it didn't matter to someone. It wasn't just him saying it was morally the right thing to do, although that may have been true. He's a politician. And I think it mattered to a lot of people. And we know that because the biggest debates to this day around American war in the past quarter century are around its brutality, not its existence. The Abu Ghraib debate, the critical journalism around drone strikes, which complain about excess civilian death. So that's one set of arguments. And, if you look at death penalty activists, they embrace the idea that there's a risk when you, even if you hate the death penalty, if you decide to struggle against the cruelty of how it's administered, you're taking a risk that it'll be harder to end after because it'll have been made less offensive, at least to some number of people. Now, that's the main argument. And then I'll just add that I'm not saying it's that the humanization of American war is the only, let alone the primary reason these wars continue. Of course, it's nowhere near the top of the list. But what I think is important is that it's a new thing in the world, that we have the possibility and the attempt to make war less offensively brutal. And I just don't see that happening before the last few decades. And that's why I wanted to, in a sense, give it some attention so that it's on the list. And we think critically about, how much of our time and energy we put into, making violence more palatable.
Great. I love that because this is since it's new, it kind of points forward conceptually in a new world. And as a theory guy, I like to speculate a bit.
Yeah.
So, we imagine in your book, okay, what if the technology gets so good that you can have almost completely humane war? You might even have war without killing. And you talk a lot about how looking into the idea of humane war has made it apparent to you that atrocity is not the essential evil of war. It's something else. So a lot of people would say, look, if we purge war of violence and atrocity, that's fabulous. You think that doesn't get to the core evil of war, which is what?
Well, domination and subjugation. I mean, I'll just use an analogy. In my country, there was this horrendous example of police brutality when George Floyd was killed. And we haven't kind of yet processed that event, which has caused so much upheaval. But you could imagine two reform projects in response. One is to make policing less brutal or even violent. Another is to have less policing, because, the most, troubling fact about American policing is that it's not universal. It's principally a way in which one group of people rules over another group of people on the basis of race. And that's why policing is intense in some places and not others. And to me, it would be chilling to preserve that relationship, but to edit the violence out. And I'm just wondering if the rise of more humane war is, in a sense, a global version of the same trend. And I close the book, not just reminding people about, how chilling it would be to have, endless global policing, even if civilian death was edited out, but imagining that we work on the protection of combatants too, because a lot of humanitarians want to make war safer for combatants. And if they get their way, without ever focusing on the larger kind of relationships, because some countries police others and the reverse isn't true, then I think we'll have made a mistake.
So the problem with American humane war, even if it's like, if we get to a point where it's not violent, is it still like America acting as a undemocratic police force for everyone in the world?
Essentially. And it's not reciprocal, so that people in Yemen don't police Americans, don't have any way of objecting, or let alone pushing back if they decide that, well, they didn't choose to have drones striking their country. Now, maybe you say, well, we need a fairer global policing system, and I'm not going to deny that there aren't threats. But of course, the fact is that for centuries and now, most people die in uses of force that work over long distances, including terrorist organizations, when great powers strike back. And so, terrorists killed a lot of people in Manhattan on September 11, 2001. But how many globally have died in the response to those events? Tens, hundreds of times more. And so, I'm for a peaceful world. And, it seems as if we want to have some system that's not just reflecting that the powerful get to protect themselves, and the weak, who are not innocent always, suffer the consequences.
Right. So there's a suffering the consequences, and the hundreds of thousands of people dying, millions. But looking even more speculatively towards this idea of like a humane world police force, right? And that how that might still be a problem.
Yeah.
Is okay. So if the wrong of war is domination, I think it's very dramatic in your book. You write about, well, what is it like to, live under drones, even if you're not being hit by them? If they're perfectly targeting only the bad guys, just the fact that you're living under this police force from America in the sky that could blow anyone you know up at any time is a shitty way to live. And that is kind of the evil of domination, that you're being controlled, your actions are being constrained by someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
and so,
I'd say what's the wrong in the policing of undesirable urban populations, for when suburbs aren't policed the same way. Well, it's the same. I mean, it's unfair hierarchy.
Well, right. And it's not reciprocal.
Yeah.
I mean, the people in Yemen cannot police the people in the United States. They have no say in this policing. But what I'm trying to move towards is if the evil of war is domination, and that's this kind of undemocratic exercise of power, there's lots of ways to do domination.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So what are the other, we mentioned policing, but even internationally, what are the other ways that the powerful actors dominate the less powerful?
Well, this book is in a sense narrow and obtuse because it's just about the organization of that form of violence we call war.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, of course, the main way that global hierarchy is institutionalized and preserved is through nonviolent means, like economics. Or, if we are looking beyond just the kind of direct interventionist war that I write about, the arms trade or proxy wars would have to be taken into consideration. So, the important thing to note is that one reason why, as we discussed, people became more permissive towards wars is that they understood that there was domination within states. And, rulers are not good people, by and large in world history. And they have had the ability to harm and even kill their populations with impunity. And of course, that's not good. And it's an intolerable form of domination. It's just that our answer to it has been to kind of ratify and intensify the domination that exists among states and allowing, powerful states to do what they want and the rest to live with the consequences. And again, Ukraine is a great example because amazingly, the day before he invaded, Putin gives this irate rant when he says, look, the West has fought all these illegal wars. The trouble is not that they're brutal, it's that they happened. And of course, then he goes on to, add insult to injury as if two wrongs could make a right. But it's just true that we're living in this permissive environment where states, if they're powerful, can fight wars if they think they can get away with, fighting. And so that's true whether they're made more humane or not.
I wonder if you are taking like an anti-war position and the basis, then I ask you what's wrong with war, you say domination, not so much atrocity. I'm fully with this. I like this. I like the idea of freedom. But how is this for a reason to focus on atrocity, which is that because, as we've established, domination happens in many different ways, and especially within states with rulers vis-a-vis the ruled, doesn't fighting domination become even more of a potential pretext for making more war than fighting human rights atrocities?
Like it could. I mean, of course that's true. I mean, it's really important to kind of go back and see that the reason why people have been concerned about atrocity is that it's one, disgusting form of domination, which people oppose. And of course, you could say, well, it's the trouble is that it ended up, perpetuating or even creating more domination, especially in the relation of powerful to weak states. And as you suggest, even if we agree to think in these terms, you could fight wars against domination pretextually. And, in some alternative universe, Putin could be saying not that he's trying to stop a genocide, but he's trying to emancipate people. And then we're not in I'm not proposing that we have some easy exit from a world in which politicians lie. Yeah, but I am suggesting that if we don't work within the domination framework, we will miss how the concern about atrocity, which can be understood as a concern about domination, fits together with, a credible view about how you reduce domination overall. And there, it just doesn't make sense to me that we would want to accept a world in which there's a lot more war in the name of having a little less brutality in the course of it. But that's not utopia.
You're saying do a big atrocity so we can get rid of domination.
Well, that was
one atrocity to end it all.
That was that old view, and it's just that it doesn't seem empirically very credible to me that it would work. But if you could prove that it would, then we'd have to have a different conversation. As far as I can tell,
ask you, what do you think is, pick one. You can get rid of atrocity or you can get rid of domination.
Right.
Like, do you die in your feet or live in your knees? Because
sure,
if you ask me, I don't know. It depends on the day, to be honest.
Well, I'm assuming you mean that if you got rid of domination, it might require violence to do so. But because otherwise, I don't see that there are aims in conflict, because it just seems that atrocity is one form of domination amongst others, because there's nonviolent domination. That's the principal form of domination in the world, nonviolent domination. And so presumably, it's you could oppose both consistently. The hard thing becomes if you have to, just begin trading off. And say, oh no, we have to incur one form of domination, atrocity, in order to advance, non-domination generally. And you probably would, but I'm not going to go so far as to argue for that. I do think that as far as I can tell from history, having fewer wars, in general, is best for freedom. And it's not a perfect picture in which freedom wins comprehensively and finally. All we know is that having as many wars as we've had lately has increased rather than decreased domination.
Good. I like that. I think that's actually a pretty good place to start to wrap up. So I just want to thank you for being on. It's been a really interesting talk. And do you have anything else to add? Maybe for the people who still think, gosh, Sam Moyn hates human rights.
Oh, well, so I don't hate human rights or humanizing war. I just think that, this book, which is mainly storytelling about various wars and people, trying to engage in some kind of attempt to make the world a better place. I just want to raise a question about the humanizing, because of the risks I think we've seen are possible, that come along with it. And then, my own answer, if you accept that there are these risks, is not to drop the project. I think we should have more humane war and more constraining rules about how wars are fought, but we'd also
just don't drop it
or manage the risk that comes along. And don't forget that, it'd be better not to have the war if it wasn't worth having than just concern oneself with its conduct. So more anti-war movements to go alongside our humanizing human rights.
Any ideas on how to make peace cool again?
Well, I think we need a 1960s where, all the songs were about it, and, culture became it became imperative in culture, and like on, the old equivalents of cell phones and TikTok and all of that to advance peace. And I actually think there are signs that that's coming. And the question is how far it can go and at what time.
Great. Well, I like that note of optimism, and I hope it's soon.
Okay. Appreciate it.
So thanks a lot for coming on.
I appreciate it.